I recently created a traditional Scottish shortbread recipe and video. With such a simple recipe, I felt I could turn it into a gluten-free shortbread. After all, us gluten-free people want some indulgence too, right? In fact, let's make that rich, buttery shortbread that has gluten in the name, not only gluten-free, but also vegan. Now that's a challenge. For some historical details and context of the traditional Scottish shortbread, see my video or recipe linked below in the description. For this video, let's get right into the scrumptious recipe. For the ingredients, you'll need rice flour, tapioca flour starch, plant-based vegan butter or regular butter, and granulated sugar. You'll also want to add salt if you're using unsalted butter. This is a very easy and simple 4-ingredient cookie. That sounds impossible for a good gluten-free recipe, but it isn't. This shortbread comes together very quickly, so go ahead and preheat your oven at 325 degrees. And you want to line an 8 by 8 inch pan with parchment paper with overhanging sides. Parchment paper doesn't sit very well into a pan, so what I like to do is take some scissors and snip the corner all the way down to where it touches the pan. And then you get overlapping flaps. And I like to do this for all 4 corners. And it just keeps our cookie on the inside nice and a smooth texture without any crazy jumbled up bumpy edges. And the paper sits in here a lot more easily. Okay, see how nicely that sits in there? Now I usually like to come back and snip off the corners that are just hanging out on the inside of the pan. Just set your pan that's ready aside until we need it. In a large bowl, go ahead and add 2 sticks of butter, and they should be softened at room temperature. You could use, again, butter, or I'm using plant-based here, so this is a vegan butter. And then with either with your hands and a spoon or with a stand mixer, just mix it up until it's nice and smooth. To the butter, we're going to add 170 grams of sugar, and I'm going to add it slowly, just so the sugar doesn't fly out. And I'm using superfine castor sugar. It's also called castor sugar or baker's sugar. I prefer baker's sugar in baking, but if you don't want to buy it, just simply take your regular granulated sugar, put it in a food processor, and pulverize it until they are small particles. Now you'll notice this one is really, really fine. It's a lot finer than granulated sugar, but it's not as fine as powdered sugar. So keep that in mind. You don't want to turn it into powder. We just want to make it smaller granules. Butter is nice and fluffy, and the sugar is all mixed in well. In a separate bowl, we're going to mix 320 grams of rice flour, and this is 2 cups. And then we're going to add 61 grams of tapioca flour, and that's a 1/2 cup. So we're adding the tapioca here, I have found, because it just adds a lot more softness to the flour because it's such a thinner type of flour than rice flour. And I have tried other flours in making this recipe. I've used coconut flour, and coconut flour just made the cookie really, really gritty. If you like coconut flavoring, you might try adding a 1/2 cup in place of a 1/2 cup of the rice flour here. But rice flour tends to produce the best results when it comes to texture and more like a shortbread cookie. You would also add 1/4 teaspoon of salt here if you were using unsalted butter. Now we're just going to sift the flour mixture in here so that it is nice and separated and dispersed and we don't have any clumps. And then whatever clumps are left over, just put them down the sink. At this point, to do this like the Scottish way, you're just going to use your hands. I'm going to scrape the edges of that bowl down first. And then I'm going to use my fingers to mix up the dough because I love the feel. It's a nice feel, but then also this is exactly what, you know, you can imagine old Scottish grandmothers doing this, but by hand is the traditional way of making this cookie. And that rice flour, it feels really soft and cool, and it's definitely a different flour to work with than regular flour. You know it's mixed enough when all the flour and butter have been mixed in. You don't have anything remaining at the bottom of your bowl. And when you can take a clump of this mixture and you can shape it into a ball and it all sticks together. Now I like the traditional Scottish shortbread fingers, so I'm going to bake mine in a casserole dish here. But if you wanted the petticoat tails that resemble Mary's Queen of Scots' old petticoat, you could also put this dough in like a pie plate or a cookie sheet, and that way you get that round circle, and then you would just slice them like pie or pizza. If you want shortbread cookies, you could just shape this into a log and then cut them into rounds and then just put them on the cookie sheet and bake them. You wouldn't bake them for as long, of course, but that's how you could get those different shapes. But for the rectangles here, once you put it in the pan, you're going to just press it down until where it's just evenly shaped all the way around. And these are pretty thick cookies, but I like this thick cookie. And since rice flour is traditional flavoring with the regular flour and a regular Scottish shortbread, I thought to do all rice flour here. But the rice flour does the trick, that with a little bit of tapioca starch, and I think we're in good shape. If you want a smoother out top, you could take like a little rolling pin and then just sort of press down to get that smooth top. I'm going to go ahead and score these. I've made these without scoring them, and then they just become a little crunchy at the end, and it's harder to score when they come out of the oven. But if we score them now in the shapes that we want when they come out of the oven, then it's easier to cut them. So I'm going to score them into 7 rows across and then just 2 rows down. So we're going to get 14 cookies out of this. So you don't want to go too deep on the scoring, but just deep enough. The cuts will probably close up in the oven, so we'll have to redefine them when this comes out of the oven. But we at least know where our cuts are going to be. So that gives us our 7 rows. I actually made it a narrow 8 one over there because I didn't like the size of my 6. It was too big. So find the midpoint and then just score them in half. Okay, so now they're all scored for bars. Okay, and the last thing we're going to do is add our traditional Scottish shortbread holes. And so I just do sort of about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch down in each bar. You could add 4 or 5 rows of holes for each bar, depending on how long they are. The edges seem to be not quite as long. There's really no purpose for this because they do bake nicely without the holes. So if you don't have time to put the holes in these, don't bother. But these are typically served at weddings or special holidays, and so the holes just give it a signature, special, decorative look. So now they're ready for the oven. So just place them in the oven and bake for 45 minutes or until golden brown. Shortbread's out of the oven, so while it's still warm, we need to redefine those lines and make definite individual bars, and then we'll add our fork just to make sure we can see those holes. We want to make those cuts defined and all the way through. And your cookie's going to separate a little bit, but that's what happens. Okay, so you'll have 7 or 8 rows across, and then we're just going to cut in the center to have 2 rows down. If you want, you could go back and add your tine marks. It's up to you. You don't have to add these at all. Or if you'd rather, wait till your cookies come out of the oven before you do any cutting in them whatsoever, adding the fork marks. Either way works. And the last thing that we do, sprinkle on a little sugar. We need to let these sit and cool in the pan for 15 minutes. And then they need to cool completely, and then they'll be easy to break apart. They're too soft now to break apart. And then they'll be ready. Okay, after 15 minutes, I'm just gonna pick up the paper with the cookies in them and then just place them on a cooling rack. And we're gonna let them cool completely before we break into them because we need to let them sit up. Since they've cooled, they've already started to separate. Okay, notice the holes on top after we redefine them. They're definitely a hard cookie. You can hear it as it hits the plate. And they break apart really easily, and they're not crumbly, so they don't crumble on you. Now that they've cooled some, check out the crumb. You can definitely tell the sandiness of the rice flour. Yep, they look like a shortbread cookie. So if you like shortbread, you should enjoy these even though they're gluten-free. I like the sugar on top gives a little bit of sparkle. This is a nice, snappy cookie. The best part, they are gluten-free and vegan-friendly. Now that makes me happy. See my recipe below in the description for optional flavor mix-ins like dried fruit, nuts, chocolate, and even Earl Grey tea. Shortbread ages well with time, so leave the cookies at room temperature for days and enjoy. Thanks for watching and for your support. Until next time, go bake the world.